Good morning. My name is Jeff Peters. I'm on staff at Bakerview Church. Thank you for tuning in this morning. In response to the recent announcements that have been made by our government and health officials regarding the spread of COVID-19, as many of you already know, Bakerview Church has suspended all of our Sunday morning gatherings and most of our ministries that we host in our building in order to cooperate with our authorities in this way. While this is not ideal, maybe it is a privilege to connect in this way. I wonder if this is actually an opportunity, maybe a gift that might bear fruit or something new for our church community. And so I look forward to God's activity among us. I look forward to the way that we respond in these kind of conditions. We don't know how long these recommendations will stay in place, but we plan to make our best effort to communicate with you electronically and other ways to keep you in the loop, keep you informed. But there are some things that we do know, or some things that we can maybe affirm, such as we can stay connected, gathering in smaller groups, gathering outside especially, as apparently COVID-19 is not as effective spreading in the outdoors. So get together where you can, safely, of course. Call each other, text each other, stay in touch, and continue to share your lives with each other. We can be positive. We can have a calm and assuring presence with our neighbors, our community, and with each other as a counteract to maybe some of the escalating fears during this time. We can pray. We should pray. We should pray together where we can and pray for all of the same things that we often pray about, but especially maybe this situation. But we can pray alone too. And so we can remember ourselves, each other, and our community while we continue our discipleship walk with God. We can show our community that we are cooperating with our authorities and doing our part. Now, most of you know, as I stated already, decisions have been made by the Bakerview Church leadership. But you can do your part by supporting these decisions and encouraging others as well, as we continually want to have our community see us as a body that is doing our part to make sure that we diminish the spread of this virus. We will try to email you over the next few weeks minimally, not often, but when important things arise, of course, we will try to reach out. If you're not on our email list, now would be a great time to do that. You can go to bakerview.org, our website, and just scroll down to the bottom on the right, and you will see a place to put your name and your email address, sign up, and then you'll be on the list for any updates that will come our way. You can also just stay tuned into the website, where we will try to post all of the most relevant updates and resources as we continue on in this fashion for this time. Thank you, and stay tuned. Now, ironically, this morning we are jumping into a story about healing. I don't know. Is it ironic? Maybe it's nothing. But as I was preparing, I couldn't help but to think of such a time as this. But this morning we will be continuing in our Lent series in the Gospel of John, as we've called it, Living Water. And there are many ways we look to be satisfied in this lifetime, in this world, and as we do, Jesus comes into our life and invites us to know Him, and calling Himself living water, a different kind of satisfier or quencher for our thirsts. And in John chapter 5, which is the text we're in this morning, it doesn't refer to Jesus as the living water, but Jesus does recommend that a man stop relying on or looking to ordinary water for his answers. And so let's read the text together, and then we can begin our learning time together. If you have your Bibles with you, I will invite you to open it to John chapter 5. And if you need a second, just press pause. John chapter 5, verse 1 to 15. Sometime later, Jesus went up to Jerusalem for one of the Jewish festivals. Now there is in Jerusalem, near the sheep gate, a pool, which in Aramaic is called Bethesda, and which is surrounded by 5 covered colonnades. Here a great number of disabled people used to lie, the blind, the lame, the paralyzed. One who was there had been an invalid for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and learned that he had been in this condition for a long time, he asked him, "Do you want to get well?" "Sir," the invalid replied, "I have no one to help me into the pool when the water is stirred. While I am trying to get in, someone else goes down ahead of me." Then Jesus said to him, "Get up, pick up your mat, and walk." At once the man was cured. He picked up his mat and walked. The day on which this took place was a Sabbath, and so the Jewish leaders said to the man who had been healed, "It is the Sabbath. The law forbids you to carry your mat." But he replied, "The man who made me well said to me, 'Pick up your mat and walk.'" So they asked him, "Who is this fellow who told you to pick it up and walk?" The man who was healed had no idea who it was, for Jesus had slipped away into the crowd that was there. Later, Jesus found him at the temple and said to him, "See, you are well again. Stop sinning, or something worse may happen to you." The man went away and told the Jewish leaders that it was Jesus who had made him well. John begins another story in his gospel, sort of like in Hollywood fashion. Sometime later, ... It's almost a device to simply separate this story from the previous stories that he had been telling. Sometime later, Jesus was up in Jerusalem at a festival. Now, sometimes John tells us exactly which festival he's at. In this case, he just says the festival or the feast. To know a little bit more about the 3 major pilgrimage festivals that Jesus and other Israelites would have attended in Jerusalem, listen to the sermon 2 Sundays ago where there was a fuller explanation on these festivals. John doesn't say which festival because for this story, that's not what is important. For this story, what's important is the day. And he will tell us just a few verses down in verse 9 that this was the Sabbath. Now, of course, we need to remember that this is not Sunday. It is not the Lord's Day as we might refer to it, but the Jewish Sabbath, which had many rituals, many rules, things to do, things not to do. This day for Jews began on Friday, or what we would know as Friday at sundown, because their day started when the sun went down, not when the sun comes up. So it started on Friday at sundown and extended through the night and through Saturday morning and afternoon and ended at sundown on Saturday. The things Jesus did on the Sabbath, if we take account of John, but also the other 3 gospel accounts, they play a major role. In fact, they might be the main reason why the Jewish leaders plot to have Jesus killed and eventually have Jesus killed. Breaking the Sabbath became one of the major things that stood in their way of getting along. The healing of the story takes place at a pool called Bethesda, and it says in the NIV Aramaic. Some texts actually might say Hebrew. We don't know if John would have been referring to the Hebrew title or whether he would have been referring to how everyday speech would have referred to it. Hebrew was still the biblical language of the day, but Aramaic was the spoken language of the day. Either way, it was a pool called Bethesda, and writings such as Josephus, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the Gospel accounts, along with archaeological digs, have confirmed the location of these pools just north of the Temple Mount near the Sheep Gate in Jerusalem. Now I say pools because there were 2. There was an upper pool and a lower pool. And then there were 4 porticos or colonnades, the Greeks would have called them stoas, that surrounded the pools, and then one that divided them. And so just to take a look at the map over here, I've drawn just a quick map of Jerusalem of that day with the Kidron Valley here, the Ben Hinnom here. City of David is in this bottom corner here with the Pool of Siloam here. We talked about that 2 Sundays ago. Here's where the temple is. Across from the temple is the Mount of Olives with the Garden of Gethsemane. And just north of the temple, we would have the sheep gate going into the temple, but just north of the sheep gate would be the 2 pools of Bethesda. These pools together would have been about the size of a football field, and in some places about 13 meters deep. The colonnades that covered or surrounded these pools would have been kind of shelters, makeshift shelters with posts, and then the one in between, maybe that is to separate the men and women. That's what some people have guessed at, but we really don't know. But it provided enough shelter that would be shade in the hot sun for people who were ill. And so you literally could drop off your loved one, your relative, your friend, and they could lie underneath the shade of these porticos next to these healing pools. Some may refer to these pools as the sheep pools because it was by the sheep gate, as I mentioned before. And so there is some who say that this is the place where during the sacrifices, especially Passover, they would have taken the lambs and washed them in this pool before bringing them through the sheep gate into the temple for the sacrifices. Public bathing was common in these days, and of course, because of the colonnades surrounding the pools, providing shade, this is a place where the sick and lame would lie, as I indicated earlier. And John tells us that a great number were lying there, and he names some of them as being paralyzed, being blind, and so forth. But one man in particular that had been there for 38 years, had been lying there consistently for 38 years. Okay, you become kind of a staple. Everybody knows Bob or Dave or Dan, as it were, would be lying there for that many years because they were always there. They were consistently there, and they got known for being there for a certain length of time. I mean, who of us today would be ill, have some sort of ailment, be recommended some sort of medication, and take it, and not get better, and continue to do it for 38 years? That's the situation we sort of have before us. Jesus leaves the festival. So the festival is probably both in the temple and in the city here. He leaves the festival and goes to the pools where he sees this man. And then he asks him something that's quite sobering, if you think about it. Do you want to be well? Now, we might pass over that quickly because it seems almost too simple of a question. It doesn't necessarily strike us when we read it. But just sit with that for a bit. Do you want to be well? And the man does not answer Jesus at this time. In fact, he doesn't answer Jesus at all in this story. The question almost is too difficult for the man. I actually see him not looking at Jesus at all during this exchange. I see him not wanting to make eye contact and just kind of looking away. But he does say something. He says, "Sir," or "Lord, I have no one to help me into the pool." And so he's not in the water. He is under one of these colonnades, and he's got no one to help him into the pool when the water is stirred. While I'm trying to get in, someone else goes down in before me. So there's something about getting into the water when it's stirred, and we have to kind of sort of guess at what that means. Unless, of course, you have a different translation that has an explanation for the stirring of the water. So go ahead and look at your Bibles and find verse 4. Did you find it? If you have an ESV or NLT, the number 4 probably won't even be in your text. If you have an NIV, you might see the number 4, but there are no words behind number 4. That's because these modern translations don't include what is verse 4 in some of the older translations like King James or I believe even the NASB. Simple explanation is that when biblical texts were being copied over the hundreds of years following the original writing of them, sometimes scribes would add little commentary notes. Sometimes these notes made their way into the text, and eventually some of the later texts, 11th, 12th century, those kinds of things, had kind of added commentary right in the text, and they got numbered that way. And so some of our first English Bibles, of course, include all of these little commentary notes. When we found older manuscripts that indicated, or earlier manuscripts that indicated that these were not a part of the original manuscripts, they took them out, but the numbering system had already existed. So we didn't include them, and you just have to skip the number. I'm just going to go find my King James Bible. Yeah, I know, I should have had this prepared ahead of time. So John 5, verse 4, for those of you who do not have access to an older Bible, says this: "For an angel went down at a certain season into the pool and troubled the water. Whosoever then first after the troubling of the water stepped in was made whole of whatsoever disease he had." It's a nice commentary piece on why the man was so adamant about his excuse of not getting into the water at a certain time, right? So if someone dropped him off there and the troubling of the water happened at that moment, then he could get help. But if that person had to leave, he can't stick around there all day, and the troubling of the water happens at an inconvenient time, then the most able person around the pool was to get in first, and only that person would get healed. It doesn't totally sound like something that God would do, but this is what some people believe. Now, for sure, the person who wrote that, the scribe who wrote that, has a Jewish mythology. In other words, would have believed that the pool of Bethesda represented a Jewish belief that these were God's healing waters, and God would send angels to trouble the waters, to provide healing in that moment. There's another kind of mythology that is possible here, and in fact, I think it is most probable, and that is that this was already filled with Roman and kind of Greek mythologies, because they've actually found remains of altar, temple type of stuff around the pool of Bethesda from the belief in a god called Asclepius, which is the Greek god for healing. And if this is the case, then all Orthodox Jews of that time would have looked at this pool not as something that God is doing for his people, but a pool of wickedness, a pool of magic, a pool of pagan ritual. This is where this man was looking for healing, and the one piece of biblical evidence that we have that actually might be the case is if you look at verse 14, where Jesus says, "Stop sinning." Well, there's no other clue in the text that this man was sinning, except, of course, if he for 38 years was looking to magic to heal his illnesses or his lameness, his weakness in body. And so that is one of the possibilities. Now, the other thing that we should consider is no mythology at all. If you don't believe that angels were stirring the waters, if you don't believe that demons or some sort of pagan ritual was stirring the waters, what was stirring the waters? Because there's clearly a belief that the waters at times were troubled. Well, as I stated in my sermon 2 Sundays ago, there was only one natural spring in Jerusalem, which was called the Gihon Spring, located somewhere around here. And this was a permanent spring. In fact, it is still a spring of water that provides fresh water today in that area. There were no other permanent freshwater springs, but there were intermittent springs that would release water from time to time. Most of the time in low-lying places where there was kind of a pool of water collected. And if the water was still there, then the springs would come up and produce a bubbling kind of effect, looking like something was being stirred in the waters. So scientifically, that probably is the best explanation of what's going on in the pools of Bethesda. The excuse the man gives for not being healed is not that he doesn't have access to the water. It is that he doesn't get into the water fast enough to take advantage of this troubling, this stirring that's going on in the water. And so every day for 38 years, he waits for his moment that never seems to come. So I love the question that Jesus asks, if we can get back to that. Do you want to get well? We might wonder why Jesus asks such an obvious question, but sit with that for a while and ask yourself, what would be the advantage of not getting well? Well, it's difficult to say because it sounds so judgmental, but maybe we have to say it just to kind of get it out into the air and then discuss it. But we get used to our disabilities. We get used to our pains and our hurting, and we take a certain kind of comfort in them. Is that okay to say? Ben Witherington, in his commentary on the Gospel of John, said this. He said, some prefer the sympathy, the attention, and the help that a lingering but non-threatening illness brings to them over the cure that would leave them without such kind of attention. Well, this is certainly an insult for all of those who are actually earnestly wanting to be healed, wanting to be well from whatever is holding them back. But there is a certain truth to it that should maybe sting a little bit for everyone else. Because the question for many of us, or all of us, in our own context of dealing with our bodies, with our minds, and with our emotions, is do we really want to be well? Or do we prefer our excuses that have become almost commonplace in our lives? Barriers of enjoying the freedoms that others enjoy. These barriers can become too commonplace for us. Now, here's the rub. Some of our barriers are excuses. Some are barriers. This makes the subject of illness and healing an incredibly difficult one because we don't always know which is which. Even when it's us, even when the sickness or the hurting is in our own life, it's sometimes hard to distinguish. Is this thing just my excuse? Or is it actually a thing? And how do I tell the difference, and what do I do about that? Some of our hurts and pains, whether they be physical or emotional or psychological, are things that may be with us until we die. Some bring death even sooner than we would prefer. And then others just linger because we don't deal with them. We don't confront them, or we don't know what to do about them. And sometimes we sort of just get accustomed to them and find ways of coping, find ways of just ignoring them and doing what's possible to continue on with life. But this just creates a bunch of interesting theological dilemmas about how God works, doesn't it? How does God work with our sicknesses, with our illnesses, or just with the areas that we would say we are hurting. How does God work? Well, my responses to this story is to talk about suffering, theology of suffering, theology of faith, and a theology of vocation. So I'll explain what I mean by these three. So I think the first thing we need to name in reading a text like this is the reality of suffering. Our primary lens for viewing all of our aches and pains, all of our hurting, is not faith, but it is our humanity. Let me explain what I mean by that. To a large degree, what history has shown us is that humanity comes with suffering. To a greater extent sometimes, to a lesser in other occasions. For the most part, this is not a direct correlation with our faith or the amount of our faith, which should immediately put a stop to all of the oppressive nature that some Christian perspectives can have on us, almost holding us captive because somehow we have not generated the right kind of faith in our lives in order to live well. So I want to state very clearly that I completely agree with the prosperity preachers out there, especially the ones on TV, who state that God's desire is that all of us, all humanity, should be well. Full stop. I want to affirm that statement. It's just how we apply that to this lifetime is when things get a little tricky, because I also completely agree with some of the theological giants, or at least they're giants in my life, such as Eugene Peterson, Walter Brueggemann, Marvedon, many others, who would say that suffering in this lifetime is not due to necessarily to an individual's lack of faith. God is not whom the pagans believed their gods were. Our God is not the same. These gods were mostly angry, looking for ways to constantly punish. They always had the need to be appeased before that they would do anything good, act justly in favor of humanity. Our God is patient. Our God enters suffering. Our God is good. But although he offers just about as much protection as maybe we collectively might want to ask for, he does not always or even ultimately keep us from bad things. Our destructive postures, God does not rescue us from ourselves all the time. We're capable of creating much pain and suffering for ourselves and for each other. We're also capable of creating much goodness, peace, and healing in our lives for each other. And so it is worth stating that there's some tension here, that some tension exists in this subject, but that suffering is not automatically or simplistically your fault. I think that's important to remember as a theology of suffering. It's more complex than that, but I wanted to begin at least stating some of those things. The second thing we need to name is that in all situations, we're called to have faith. We might resist a faith response because of the tension of not fully knowing what to do with human suffering. And so these two kind of belong together in many conversations. But we must persist to the point of risking disappointment with God, because we are called to be a people of faith. We are called to hope. We sometimes fear having faith because of the hurt and anger we feel when healing doesn't come our way, even though we've risked having faith. It's not unlike the other risks that we've taken in life, such as when you've tried to pursue someone to be a partner, a life partner. You've tried to woo someone to like you more than a friend, And so you put yourself out there, we might say. We risk and we become vulnerable, and we tell someone what we're feeling inside. This has similarities. Obviously, nothing is the same in those regards. But of course, on a much bigger scale, how much of our theology, how much of your theology on faith and suffering, how much of your kind of mental framework about how God works solely rests on that one experience you had when it didn't go your way? I mean, is that the bedrock? Is that what we want to base our thoughts on about what God will or will not do when we respond to him in faith? Once you've been shot down, it's very, very difficult to go there again. But we must. Not because we must get God to do the things that we want him to do, but this is ultimately what helps us see the world the way that God sees the world. Listen, when we pray to God and do things according to the way that according to the way that we want them done, and God answers all of our prayers exactly how we prayed, that's a pretty scary world. I'm not sure if I want that to be true. There are a lot of people praying for things that I'm not sure would be a really, really good thing for our world. So while we trust that we're asking with a pure heart, we're asking with a desire for God to change things for good as far as we can see them, we ultimately express this faith to be near to God, not so that God can do all of the things that we want him to do. If faith has been difficult for you, can I encourage you to not give up? Not so that you can finally persuade God to do what you want done, but so that you will be at peace, knowing more of God's heart. The third and last thing I would like to name is probably going to sting the most, because it comes right down to motivations, which are very difficult to ascertain, to understand, and even more difficult to control, even if we do understand them. It sort of reminds me of winning a lottery. Getting healed is kind of like winning that lottery, right? And what would you do if you won the lottery? If you all of a sudden had millions of dollars, what would you do with the rest of your life? Most of the time, I actually think that our motivations for whatever it is that we want lie dormant or hidden. They don't like to draw attention to themselves because they know that they're going to get called out, and so they hide, or perhaps they put up they put on different clothes. They put up a front, a very compelling case for why this thing that we want is good, and our motivations help us with that kind of creativity to put up this front, this what people see as very, very solid, very Christian idea that I want. Look, basically arguing with me, it would be arguing with Jesus. So, and our motivations kind of help us to put up that kind of front. But deep down inside, there's this other part of us that may not have been informing the ethics part of our brain of anything that's going on, while it is putting this front up, trying to persuade ourselves or others around us that this is what should be done. And that's unfortunately the same kind of mentality we sometimes use with God, as though God can't see our actual motivations for this and how this is all about me. Having the right motivations may or may not be related to your faith response. It may or may not be related to the healing response that comes to you or does not. But I can tell you this: reflecting on your motivations as you go on with life and you confront or address the barriers in life, whether that be physical or emotional or psychological or whatever it is that is causing you pain, whatever it is that ails you or that is hurting. Reflecting on these and seeing the motivations behind these will sharpen your sense of purpose in life. It will sharpen your mission, your vocation, the things that you are called to do, not that you just want to do, but that you have a sense that this is why God made you. And no doubt it will immediately inform you of how you would live if you received healing from God. Are you hurting? I don't know if you resonate with this man at the pools of Bethesda who was lying there for years and years waiting to be cured. And certainly it's too minimalistic just to say, just trust in Jesus. It's not wrong to say that, but sometimes it sounds minimalistic. But I do want to say that God invites us all to consider being satisfied in Him. And who knows? The living water that we learn to rely on might show us something that we hadn't considered before about ourselves, about God, about the world that we live in. Now, I realize that I have not given you many answers this morning, but I hope that I've at least maybe stirred or troubled the waters in your hearts and your minds on a few things. And if you're currently meeting in some sort of small group or with a friend, and you're planning to have a conversation after this, or perhaps you're going to plan to meet a time later, I would really encourage you to look up the resources, the follow-up questions that have been created for this text. You can find that at bakerview.org. Just go to the Home Church tab, and there will be a set of questions there for you to continue this conversation. God's peace be with you.